what does Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 through 30 and 35 through 39 mean? The epistle to the Hebrews, you can't understand the epistle to the Hebrews unless you understand two things. First of all, to whom was this letter specifically written? Well, what's the title? Epistle to the Hebrews. It was written to Hebrews, Hebrew believers. When did this come? It was written just before the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D., because it was still standing, probably sometime during the latter 60s, probably from somewhere between 65 and 69 A.D. Now, that can be established by simply going through the epistle and reading it carefully. But you have to understand that there were unique problems for Hebrew believers when the temple was still standing, because by the 60s, they were being persecuted for being believers. And so how does an Israelite relate to those who are beginning to relentlessly persecute them when he has become a believer in Jesus as the Messiah? Well, there are several warning passages in the epistle to the Hebrews, and this is the most severe of the line of warnings that go through the epistle. And so, put yourself back in around 68, 69 A.D. You're a Hebrew believer, and you've seen friends who have believed in Jesus as Messiah being persecuted, all of their possessions taken over and confiscated, their homes taken and confiscated, and they're put in prison, many executed. So how do you relate to that? Well, you try to be quiet about being a believer in Jesus. And that's what the Epistle to the Hebrews is addressing. Those who were refusing to stand up and refuse to be intimidated and stop speaking about Jesus as their true believer. When they're faced with, are you a believer in Jesus or your Messiah, they would say no. And so the Jewish religious leaders knew that there were some that were not telling the truth. So they devised a clever way of forcing Jewish believers in Jesus to either come to the temple and offer a sacrifice, as everyone is supposed to do at least once a year. They made it so that you had to do that and register that you had done it. And so they figured that a true believer in Jesus wouldn't do that. But there were some believers that were so frightened, they went to the temple and offered animal sacrifice for their sins. And this was a complete compromise of their testimony in Jesus. Because you see, what was Jesus called by John the Baptist when he first saw him? He said, "Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world." Well, he was talking about temple worship and all of those things they did, which were designed to be a symbol and a kind of an allegory of what Jesus was going to do when he came. And so, for them to go into the temple and offer a lamb for their sins was tantamount, now that Jesus had come and fulfilled that, it was tantamount to trampling underfoot the blood of Christ and putting him to open shame. You see, because that has already been fulfilled in Jesus, and after that there is no more animal sacrifice for sin. Jesus is now the only sacrifice for sin. He has fulfilled what the animal sacrifices only pointed them to. So, let's read this. Now remember that background. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. How had they come to the knowledge of the truth? Well, these were Hebrew believers that Jesus had died for their sins. He's the Lamb of God. In Hebrews, it talks about the once and for all sacrifice for sins, Jesus. He fulfilled all of these symbols that were done in the temple. And so for them to go back and offer an animal sacrifice after coming to the knowledge of the truth and believing in him. And by the way, after 70 A.D., this was a sin that couldn't be committed because the temple was destroyed. And there was no place to go offer such a thing. But in that time, they could. And so he says, once again, for if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth. What was the willful sin? The willful sin was knowing the lamb was fulfilled in Jesus, going back and offering it in the temple. He says, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. Now, it doesn't mean they've lost their salvation. It doesn't mean that believing in Jesus and receiving the gift of pardon for their sins and being born again and put into union with Christ, that isn't undone. But it does mean there's no sacrifice for sin other than Jesus. They're going through a meaningless ceremony and tradition that had no meaning. And it was something even greater than that. It says, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversary. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. In other words, a person who was put to death for some offense to the law didn't lose salvation if he was a believer, but he lost his physical life. You see, once we become a believer, we're saved eternally, but our fellowship with God can be cut off. And that is what this is referring to. And so it says, how much severe punishment do you think he will deserve? Now listen carefully and remember the imagery of the temple. How much severe punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God? How's he doing that? By knowing that he is the fulfillment of all of the prophecies in the temple sacrifices. He is the one and only, once and for all, atonement for sin. And they're trampling underfoot that atonement by going back to the old system that's already been fulfilled. So they are trampling underfoot the Son of God and have regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace. You see, to go back offering animal sacrifice and the blood of a lamb as the offering for sin, when they know that Jesus has died once and for all for salvation and for forgiveness, is to trample underfoot his blood and to put him to open shame. You see, that is a severe sin. And many of them committed this, and it became the sin unto death for them. They will stand before the living God and have to answer for that, but they're still saved because, remember, 2 Corinthians chapter 3 talks about the fact that we will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Our works are going to be evaluated. Some will have gold, silver, and precious stones. That's their works of faith that count. Others will have wood, hay, and stubble. And it says the flame of God's judgment will find out each one's motive. And it says, if a man's works are burned up, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved. Yet so is through fire. In other words, they're going to be, as I've said before, a lot of believers who are going to have the smell of smoke on their robes, but they'll be there. And this is a severe situation here. So